The government should take care of disaster remediation. When disaster strikes, the people affected often depend on the government to fulfill its responsibilities and to support them in their worst moments.
Hurricane Agnes caused the flood of 1972. Hurricane Agnes was a tropical storm that started on the Yucatan Peninsula June 14, 1972, then moved through the Gulf Coast, later hitting the panhandle of Florida on June 19, 1972. Then moving up the East Coast, it left a path of devastation behind it. The hurricane stalled over the Pennsylvania-New York border. The Corning Museum of Glass is located where the red arrow is pointing just north of the Pennsylvania line. This flood caused so much damage to the Corning area because Agnes lingered and continued to dump rain for about 3.5 days without stopping.
Unfortunately, the people in Corning were not prepared for a storm of this magnitude. Many southern tier communities had not taken proper flood precautions since it had been nearly 4 decades since the last serious flood, the flood of 1935. Though this storm did not bring as much rainfall as Agnes, it had killed nearly twice as many people due, in part, to poor communication technology. Despite Agnes bringing a worse flood in 1972, people had better odds because of innovations in the telephone, radio, and computers, which were just starting to assist in creating weather forecasts. Even though better tech told people a storm was coming in 1972, they did not expect a storm of this magnitude. Better communication technologies helped, but many failed due to power outages. In this regional emergency, the Corning Museum of Glass was nearly destroyed because saving artifacts was not a peak priority for first responders when so many lives and livelihoods were at stake.
Hurricane Agnes injured many people and caused millions of dollars worth of damage. It destroyed many buildings and left many others filled with mud. The Corning Museum of Glass got hit hard. The museum had many artifacts, archives, and decorative glassware that was swept away, destroyed by the flow, or covered in mud.
The museum had opened on May 19, 1951, just 21 years before, as a nonprofit educational institute chartered by the Board of Regents of the State University. In that short amount of time, it had assembled an impressive collection of glass items ranging from 18th century BC dynasty Egyptian glass to the work of contemporary glassblowers, and including roughly 13,000 pieces of cut, gilded, free-blown, mold-blown, engraved, and enameled glass from all parts of the globe. This collection covered every technique, period, and area in the history of glass.
This museum included the Ray Cowell Library, archives containing some of the world's most comprehensive literature on the subject of glass. At the time of the flood, the museum had a collection of over 600 very rare books that provided a major source for scholars and collectors, an educational experience for students. The museum staff even assisted in many archaeological digs to discover more artifacts.
The Chemung River was the main cause of the damage to the museum and the rest of the town. At the height of the flood, the galleries were completely submerged under more than 5 feet of filthy water. Bookcases full of rare books were overturned. As the water rose, many glass items floated from their shelves. Some of these objects settled down as the water receded. However, many of them came out cracked, broken, or overturned. The receding water left behind a thick layer of mud. Initially, the museum staff members and some volunteers tried to clean up the mess alone. Eventually, many other major museums and associations, including the New York State Historical Association, Newark Museum, Rochester Museum, and the Science Center, assisted with cleaning up the mess.
Though many pieces in the museum had been disturbed, only 3% of the items had been damaged, or 353 pieces out of the whole.
As part of the recovery effort, waterlogged books were frozen to remove the risk of potential mold growth. The same procedures were used on the museum's files and films. Many of these items remain in cold storage today.
The cleanup process was very delicate and time-consuming. Restorers only used clean water and very small brushes to recover the artifacts covered in thick mud. Many people came together from the community to help clean up the disaster.
They shouldn't have needed to. The mess in the museum should have been the state government's responsibility, as the Corning Museum of Glass is a state-sponsored museum. The Corning Museum of Glass is a focal point for tourism industry in the town of Corning.
This disaster is significant to not only local history but also important to many other places. This tropical storm caused significant damage that extensive precautionary measures had to be taken to avoid similar problems in the future. After the flood of 1972, these preliminary precautions included water dams, dikes being built around towns, and controlling the flow of water with man-made water channels. The Corning Museum of Glass made plans and ensured that their insurance would cover a disaster in the future, and they also copied some important artifacts in case they got destroyed in some way from any flood or non-flood disaster.
This local disaster should be more familiar to spread awareness that even in small towns, disasters can still happen. This historical event gives some context as to why some flood prevention measures were put in place, like dikes around towns, dams, and other flood prevention applications all across the southern tier.
This flood had the greatest impact on the Corning Museum of Glass. However, the museum was not the only thing in devastation. Only 15 miles away, in downtown Elmira, a popular news reporter, Paul Orlowski from our local weather provider, WENY, he started broadcasting emergency evacuation orders shortly after the power went out. He and his co-workers were trapped for several days, surviving only off the snacks in the vending machine. From the roof of his 7-story building, he watched cars, trees, buildings, and other debris float away.
The flood of 1972 was a very impactful disaster that should be talked about more to ensure similar events don't happen in the future, and the government needs to be ready to step in and take responsibility for inadequate flood dikes and dams if they are breached in the future.